What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past weekend and talk about what's doing well. And I will apologize, this one is coming out a little bit later than normal. That is because I was live over the weekend at the 8TC Team Championship. There was an enormous 8-player team event held in Tennessee. I live streamed that all weekend, and you can go check out the VODs for that over on my channel. Now, we won't be talking about that event today because we focus on singles events here for the show, but we did have a big weekend with a ton of pretty interesting singles event results to discuss. And so without further ado, let's dive in and talk about those with a metagame breakdown. The new Aeldari are strutting their stuff with a pretty strong finish this week. 2 undefeated results, one 5-0 and one with a draw on the record from the Clutch City GT. That was one of the larger GTs happening this weekend. The CAG Bash 17 also saw an undefeated Aeldari result, as well as they took down the East Anglian GT. Chaos Space Marines both took down the Games of Westeros 19, as well as Midgard Games GT. And we had a ton of undefeated results from Dark Angel. And we had an insane variety of Space Marine results, undefeated Space Marine armies from essentially every chapter, at least Ultramarines and all of the non-Codex compliant chapters from across the Super Faction. That included Blood Angels, who not only took down the single largest event of the weekend, that was the Manchester 40k Super Major, and we will definitely be talking more about the Super Major results later on the channel this week if you want to stay tuned to that, but also taking down the Plus Pop GT. Dark Angels saw 2 undefeated results. Those were unfortunately 2 XO and 1 results from the Midcon GT, as well as Loban 40k singles. Although the Midcon GT, I believe, was a natural draw. That was 2 identical scores on the scorecard. Loban 40k singles use a differential scoring system, so draws are a lot more common using that scoring method. We also saw Deathwatch at the A&H Games Golden Bolters. Space Wolves take down the Triple Cities GT. Ultramarines also undefeated with an XO and 1 at the Loban 40k singles. Adeptus Custodes also undefeated with a tie for the top spot at the Midcon GT. Chaos Demons at the Grip Figure Spell. Tyranids undefeated at Games of Westeros 19, and 2 undefeated results from the relatively large Clutch City GT, both Orks and Imperial Knights. Now, if you want to take a look at any of these events on live coverage, there were a couple channels streaming this weekend. Not only was I streaming the 8TC team event, but if you want to see some singles content, Wargames Live was live over at the Clutch City GT. Paladins de Terra was also live on Twitch with the Brush and Bolter event. I'm not sure what the details of that event were, but they did live stream 2 days worth of 40k content over there. All of those will be linked down in the video description, and if you have any other channels that were live streaming 40k this weekend, go ahead and throw them down in the comment section so we can watch along with them. Now, before we dive into the lists themselves, I want to give a quick shout out to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise and helps me make this content either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, you can join in the join link down below the video, as well as Twitch subscribers who help me over on Twitch. All of you people are amazing. You help me fund these videos and dedicate time to them, and I really appreciate it. And at the very least, a like and a subscription on the video to help out the channel would also be appreciated. And with that, let's dive into these lists. Now, we're going to start over in Ohio for the CAG Bash 18 Grand Tournament. This was a 39-player tournament and was won by Peter Elias running Aeldari. Now, Peter was running a Warhost. This is a detachment that we haven't seen too much of since the Codex was released, but does look like it has some really spicy combinations in it. It includes a lot of ways to move your units faster, make better use of your agile maneuvers, as well as ways to move your units after they attack. The army included Azerman, who brings his own variety of Fire and Fade to the force, an Autark, Eldrad Ulthran, and Lycus. Eldrad is particularly good inside Warhost since he is able to trigger his ability at the start of the shooting phase to doom a unit. You can then fire with his unit and use Fire and Fade to return them to safety, allowing him to not only generate the command points to support the army and all of their movement shenanigans, but also be consistently getting that +1 to wound. We then have a unit of Storm Guardians for objective secured and potentially to protect that character. 2 Wave Serpents. As I mentioned before, we have several ways to move units after they fire. So in a position where we aren't using a Fire and Fade elsewhere, we can be filling these 2 Wave Serpents up with 10 model units, probably of these Dark Reapers. We see 25 Dark Reapers in the army, 2 units of 10 and a unit of 5, all of them with Tempest Launchers. We can disembark those 2 units of Dark Reapers, fire with one of them, and Fire and Fade with it. Then at the end of the turn, use Skyborn Sanctuary to put the other one into the transport as well, allowing you a lot of long-range shooting while still remaining safe. On top of that, Azraman also moves his unit after shooting. We have a Dire Avenger unit and a Falcon that can take those 5 Dire Avengers alongside Azraman inside it. They can use Azraman's Fire and Fade that's baked in to also move after shooting, meaning that these 25 Aspect Warriors plus a Phoenix Lord are able to jump out of their transports, attack the enemy, and then jump back in with impunity. We also then have a unit of Fire Dragons, 10 Fire Dragons in one and 5 in another unit. Take down some larger targets, 1 unit of Striking Scorpions for forward operation, and 2 units of Warp Spiders for utility. The additional Agile Maneuvers points for these units also help quite a bit, since you're able to run this MSU style a little bit more efficiently than you would in an army that's only generating the standard number of Agile Maneuvers tokens. Now with that, we're going to move off Aeldari for a moment here and talk about some Chaos Space Marines. Ease our way into Space Marines proper by talking about their spiky cousins and go to my old stomping grounds, the Midgard ITC Grand Tournament. This one was won by Michal Niemierko, who was running none other than a Fellhammer siege host. Now I've actually seen this army in person on the table, can confirm that it is quite a combination, and it is cool to see Fellhammer siege host on the battlefield because it is not a detachment that we've really seen played that much since the Chaos Space Marine Codex came out initially. Now this detachment makes its army incredibly difficult to kill from range. One downside that a lot of these Chaos Space Marine armies have is that they do have the ability to punch up above their weight class, but they oftentimes will fall back on the crackback. However, with an almost universal -1 to be wounded against ranged attacks, effects like 5+ feel no pain against ranged attacks, as well as enhancements like the Bastion Plate to protect a Terminator unit against failed saving throws, this army becomes very difficult to kill. So with that, we have Abaddon the Despoiler. He's able to project a 4+ invulnerable save aura to everything in his vicinity. We have Cypher to punish enemies from coming in and attacking the army in melee by increasing the cost of their stratagems. Fabius Bile, who has the potential to increase the toughness characteristic of his unit that he's attached to, plus improving their strength as well, so they're a little bit harder hitting in melee. That unit can hang out with Abaddon, get a 4+ invulnerable save, -1 to be wounded theoretically, and +1 toughness. So stacking all those things on top of each other, plus using the Surgeon on Fabius Bile to blank failed saving throws once per turn, makes this unit very hard to deal with. We then have a Chaos Lord with Ironbound Enmity, another Chaos Lord with the Bastion Plate I mentioned earlier, allowing you to blank failed saving throws for that unit, and a Master of Executions with Iron Artifice. Following that up, we have huge bricks of infantry to follow these guys around. That includes a 10-model Terminator squad, a 10-model Chosen squad for Fabius Bile to jump into, another 5-model Chosen squad likely for Abaddon the Despoiler to hop into as well, 2 units of 2 Bikers, alongside 2 Chaos Rhinos to carry the lighter units in the early game, and 2 Nurglings for forward operation. This army is, I think, deceptive in what it can do. It doesn't have a huge number of buffs in melee, but the baseline profiles and dark packs that Chaos Space Marines already have built in, plus we get rerolls from Abaddon the Despoiler as well, means that it's actually pretty good at fighting almost regardless, and its ability to sustain and simply basically take entire shooting phases off of your opponent is enormous. If you don't have a ridiculous amount of attack volume, you're just going to be pressured out by this list. It's going to run 30-ish heavy infantry into your face, stack a bunch of wound penalties on them, make them very difficult to kill, and you're going to have a tough time pushing back from that. Lists like these are really exciting. It's obviously not very often that we see a Fellhammer siege host on the competitive pay table, and less often that we see it win an event. Huge congratulations to Mikhail for taking this event down and doing it with such a stylish army. Now with that, we're going to move over to the biggest event of the weekend, the Manchester Super Major. This was an almost 350-player Super Major event held in the United Kingdom. It ran a staggering 7 rounds over 2 days, absolute test of might here for these players, and it was won by Alex Harrison, who went 7-0 after those rounds. Now, the Manchester Super Major typically cuts to a top 4 after the round 5, so even though there are going on 400 players in the event, anyone who doesn't have the correct tiebreakers to get to that top 4 will not be eligible to win the total event, so this means that this army was high scoring when it got to that point. Alex is playing what is a pretty common sight at this point, that being a Liberator's Assault group running Bloodless Angels, or Blood Angels that have no actual Blood Angels units in them, making them eligible for +1 to wound from the Oath of Moment update. This includes, interestingly, 2 Judiciars as its only characters. We're not seeing any of the jump captains or the sustained hits captains, the Rage-Filled Warrior captains that we typically see. Only Judiciaries are playing this time. That gives the army a lot of melee presence on the battlefield. These Judiciaries have fight first. They do pretty significant damage when they are charging or heroically intervening. They're getting additional attacks that they can trigger into devastating wounds with their relic blades. They're going to be attaching into Assault Intercessor squads to get wound rerolls and trigger those devastating wounds even more often as well. And in a position where we're trying to fight things like Aeldari that can come in with a super long threat range, we're trying to fight things like Legion of Excess Chaos Demons that are almost entirely melee oriented. The ability to fight first and potentially kill those demon units or those elves before they come in and hit you is a huge benefit. Obviously, Legion of Excess has ways around that. They can take away their own ability to fight first anyway. However, the big benefit there is that you will get to remove models from those units before they get to attack, even if they are getting their full hit and wound rerolls. Now, we have 2 Impulsors to carry those Assault Intercessors around, 3 units of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors, which is standard for this style of army, 3 units of 5 Incursors. These guys are a little interesting. You see them almost typically in these styles of Bloodless Angels. They do have huge synergy with Liberator Assault Force. They can advance and charge for a command point. Normally you would have to battle shock yourself to advance and shoot. However, the Incursors can do that innately. Their weapons are assault weapons. They can then buff your other shooting, allowing you to put your Oath of Moment on something a little bit more dangerous or that you're going into melee with, and the Incursors are affecting your shooting, so you're splitting your accuracy buffs pretty appropriately and getting good use of those over the breadth of the entire engagement rather than all stacking them on one unit. And the Incursors are particularly strong in melee. They have sustained hits, they have a point of AP, and getting additional strength and attacks from the Liberator Assault Group benefit is huge for them. We then also have an Infiltrator Squad to protect the backline. Interestingly, 2 Invictor Tactical War Suits. The Incursors do scout, so we also then have some more additional forward operation from those Tactical War Suits, and with their Incendium Cannons, they can punish other forward operators by counterattacking them, overwatching, and potentially sort of dominating the middle of the table there and taking down those light infantry that would prevent your other melee units from getting stuck in. The other benefit these guys have, obviously, is an increase in their attack volume from Liberator Assault Group is huge because they don't actually have that great of a melee profile, even if they're fast and in a position where they're typically going to be in a good spot to fight, and their ability to reactively attack is huge in an army that is focusing on these Incursors as well. We then have a bunch of ranged attacks from some armored vehicles, 3 Predator Destructors with las cannon sponsons, and some utility that coming in the form of a Scout Squad and 3 Suppressor Squads. I think the Suppressor Squads are still underrated in the Space Marine Codex. For 75 points, you get 3 12-inch moving infantry. They have a pretty solid range profile, especially if you are getting hit bonuses or you're firing at your Oath of Moment target. That's not the most exciting thing about them, though. It's mostly the cheap, super fast options that allows these guys to deep strike, to move early, to get mid-board secondaries in the early game, to screen very effectively without you having to break the bank for that, like you would if you were taking 5 Jump Pack Intercessors, for example. Just a nice inclusion all around. But overall, pretty standard stuff that we've been seeing from Blood Angels more recently, taking that sort of Bloodless Angels build. Now with that, we're going to move over to Austria, to the Loben 40k singles. This was a 75-player GT, and it saw several undefeated placements. We saw Chaos Knights win, which we'll talk about later on in the video, but we also saw undefeated results from both Ultramarines and Dark Angels. Now, this was not the only undefeated result from Dark Angels this week, but it was also their second draw. Dark Angels were really just scoring a minimum number of points to do well this weekend. However, we are going to talk about this list that did go undefeated 4-0-1 with a draw on its record. Conrad Schmuck running a Gladius Task Force. Now, we actually streamed a Gladius Task Force like this over the weekend, and it's cool to see some additional competitive play on top of that. This includes Azrael, as well as a Judiciary and a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, alongside a Tech Marine, 1 Assault Intercessor Squad, a unit of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors for utility, 3 Deathwing Knight units. So we are conclusively not running that Bloodless Angels build. We do have Azrael on the list as well, so we are generating CP. But obviously the Deathwing Knights bring resilience, they bring hard-hitting melee, and they also bring some maneuverability in their teleport homers, allowing them to rapid ingress for free, which is very nice. They also benefit enormously from Gladius Task Force buffs. Being able to advance in charge or fall back in charge for these guys is huge because they will oftentimes be outpaced by their opponent with their low base movement characteristic. So the advance in charge is big, and they will also oftentimes be stuck in a melee for multiple rounds, so being able to fall back in charge with Tactical Doctrine is big. We then have an Inner Circle companion unit for Asriel to join into. He gives them an invulnerable save and sustained hits to stack with their lethal hits. It's all very nice. We have a scout squad and shooting provided by a trio of Vindicators as well. I think for the most part, the sort of combination of Gladius Task Force, these characters, and the Vindicators is pretty standard. We have been seeing a variety of it playing Dark Angels increase more recently. This is kind of an old school version of this army. It's a year or so old. It's not really using any of the new buffs that we saw from the December Space Marine update, but it is still tried and true and very effective nonetheless. Now, with that, let's move on to Ruston, Louisiana in the United States for a relatively small event, the ANH Games Golden Bolters. This was a small GT, only 20 players, but it was won by Gabriel Rivera running Deathwatch. So many Space Marine chapters undefeated this week. Absolutely wild showing from various versions of this faction. This was a Black Spear task force, I think, as we are expecting to see from Deathwatch. This includes a Gravis Captain with Tome of the Exclades, give that double re-rolls on 2 separate units with those at the moment. We have another Gravis Captain with the Thief of Secrets to improve his strength and damage. Importantly, that also affects his offhand weapons. So oftentimes we'll see these Gravis Captains with a Boltstorm Gauntlet in one hand and either a sword or a chainsword or a fist in the other hand. The Thief of Secrets will buff the stats of both of those. Or taking a chainsword, you can have up to 8 or 9 4 damage melee attacks once the thief has stolen the secrets from the opponent by killing a model, and that can make this guy an absolute blender in melee. We are running double fists here today, however. We have a combi weapon lieutenant alongside a standard intercessor squad, a couple of Deathwatch Terminator squads, 3 Deathwatch Terminators with 3 Cyclone missile launchers apiece. Pretty standard, just kind of as the, I don't want to say battle line, but as the front line of this army. They are not super expensive. They have lots of shooting. Several Stormbolters plus 3 missile launchers in the unit is quite a bit of shooting for a little unit like these guys. And they are relatively resilient to kill on the crackback. We have Storm Shields on, looks like the non-Cyclone missile launcher equipped Terminators. So you have to fight through 4 wounds on each of those before you actually get to the Cyclone missile launcher units. And these are not enormous bricks that you can really focus a lot of firepower onto. So actually getting the attacks to kill them is a little bit tough sometimes. We then have some long-range shooting from a Gladiator Lancer, as well as 2 Indomitor kill teams to attach those Gravis Captains into. Those guys are each equipped with what looks to be 3 Eradicators with Melta rifles. One of them has a multi-Melta. We have 3 Boltstorm Gauntlet equipped aggressors, plus 2 heavy bolters and 2 standard heavy bolt rifles. Now, if you haven't seen this unit on the table, they can put out immense damage at long range. You can use the special issue ammunition stratagems to increase their range and AP and allow them to fire things like multi-meltas way, way farther than you would expect. If they're firing at the closest targets, which they can oftentimes finagle by using their teleportarium stratagem, then they get +2 strength. So you're firing things like strength 11 AP 5 Melta shots and strength 7 AP 3 bolter shots with multi-damage, which is pretty scary when it comes down to it. We then also have an Infiltrator squad to protect the back line and a Talon Strike kill team that's including 5 Inceptors with Plasma Exterminators. Those guys get +1 AP when they drop in, so those Plasma Exterminators are good for kind of spot removal. You can drop them in on a tank or something that's looking a little scary, buff them up with special issue ammunition, and with those 5 Plasma Exterminators, probably just dumpster whatever your opponent gave you, and then you hope that you can pick those guys up and do it again on a future turn as well. Pretty classic Deathwatch list. Nice to see Deathwatch doing well, and this list looks extremely good. Now, with that, we're going to move over to the Triple Cities GT to talk about Space Wolves. Now, I'm actually not going to talk about the player's name here on this video because I'm going to roast them a little bit. As the, I guess, sort of title of their list, they copy and pasted the entirety of the screenplay to Gladiator. That is kind of funny. Are you not entertained? But it's also just sort of obnoxious and stupid. And if somebody was reviewing that with a critical eye, they could say that maybe something like an attempt to make it difficult for the opposing player to actually parse what is in your list. I'll try to include what the scroll bar on the window I'm recording right now is, but the actual list is the last about 5% of the scroll bar here, and the rest of the page is hundreds and hundreds of lines from an unrelated movie. That's just stupid. Don't do that. It's rude. It makes it more difficult for your opponent, and that's not good for anyone. But we are talking about some champions of Russ here. This player did take a Space Wolf army using the Space Wolf detachment to an undefeated record 5-0 at this event, running a bunch of characters: Bjorn the Fell-Handed, Logan Grimnar, Ragnar, Blackmane, and a bunch of Thunderwolf characters. We have a Phobos Lieutenant, as well as 2 Thunderwolf Lords and 2 Thunderwolf Battle Leaders. We have 2 Assault Intercessor squads, one of them almost certainly taking Ragnar Blackmane to hang out with. We have a Reaver squad, Scout, and 2 Scout squads for forward operation, plus a Wolfen unit for some backline support, say counter-punch, melee counter-punch after these Thunderwolf cavalry units go in. We have a little bit of long-range shooting from a Gladiator Lancer, some delivery for the Assault Intercessors with an Impulsor, and then the 2 big bricks of 6 Thunderwolf cavalry. Obviously, this detachment has a lot of really big benefits for the Thunderwolf cavalry. Doing things like advancing and charging those guys is pretty nice because we also have buffs for the rest of the army. Unlike Stormlands Task Force, which essentially only buffs the Thunderwolves, it does make the Thunderwolves run a little bit less efficiently than we would do in Stormlands, where they get things like 9-inch advances and the advance and charge for free. However, we can use things like these infantry and still get the benefits of the detachment again for those. So a little bit more well-rounded than the standard Stormlands builds, and it is nice to see some ancient characters like Bjorn the Fell-Handed in here as well. He can kind of follow in the Thunderwolf cavalry and make it difficult to engage in with them. He's a big brick and sort of in the center of this army, so even if you can cut through the Thunderwolf cavalry, he's actually very hard to take down. And then he can make it difficult for units that are trying to counterpunch them by taxing their command points when those units try to come in and fight them. So that's a nice inclusion. 2, and we have some very early game engagement from Ragnar Blackmane, who's naturally relatively fast. Nice to see Space Wolves doing pretty well, because I think after the Space Marine update, we haven't seen them too much. But like I said, it is the weekend of the Space Marines, apparently, because they're doing everything. Now, with that, we're going to move back to the Lobin Spring Singles and talk about Ultramarines. We actually have a couple more lists to talk about from this event, but we have an interesting Gladius task force coming from Ultramarines this week. This is Burnt Sorger. Who's running a Gladius task force build, including some characters such as Cato Sicarius, who we haven't really seen too often in the past, in this detachment explicitly. We also have a combi weapon Lieutenant Marnius Calgar and Robute Gilliman in the army, an Intercessor squad, a Jump Pack Assault Intercessor squad, as well as a couple Ballistus Dreadnoughts, 2 Ballistus Dreadnoughts in there. A Company Heroes squad, probably for Marnius Calgar to hop into, although he can hop into most of these units. We have some utility brought by an Infiltrator squad and an Inceptor squad, alongside a Stern Guard veteran squad and 2 Vindicators. Now, if I had to hazard a guess, I would guess that the Cato Sicarius was jumping into the Stern Guard Veterans unit. He grants that unit an automatic 6-inch scout, which can help deliver them in the early game, and a reactive move, so even as they push forward, they can potentially jump back into a defensive position after shooting. He also grants their weapons assault, and while most of the Stern Guard veteran weapons already have assault, the heavy bolters explicitly don't, so he actually allows the unit to advance and shoot all the time without even having to rely on anything like Devastator Doctrine to get them in there. It's a pretty interesting inclusion if that is how he was being used. He could also join, there's just a standard Intercessor squad that he could maybe join into to bring a Scout OBSEC unit to the table, which is also super nice if you have objectives outside your deployment zone that you can scout onto to hold at the start of the game. But otherwise, nice to see some separate inclusions in Space Marines that we have been seeing. This isn't just the standard sort of triple Vindicator army that we see normally. There are a lot of Vindicators in here, but we are seeing these Stern Guard veterans and a little bit off color characters that we don't normally see inside this army. That said, obviously, Ultramarines have such a selection of characters that we can expect to see a huge variety of them, because you can make all sorts of weird combinations from them. Now, with that, we will go to our other factions. Let's stay with this event momentarily here and talk about Chaos Knights. Peter Steiner went undefeated with Chaos Knights at the Lobin Spring Singles, and it's a pretty standard list. I'll be honest, folks, I don't have much to say about it. It's 6 Brigands, 6 Carnivores, and a War Dog Stalker with Aura of Terror to lock in objectives. Very straightforward, very easy, a classic Chaos Knights list that we've seen many times in the past. Now, also moving over to the MidCon GT. This was held in Denmark. As I mentioned before, we had an undefeated Dark Angels player from this event, but interestingly, they had an X and O and 1 result, so a tie on their record. And the army that they tied with was Adeptus Custodes, which we get to talk about now. This is an interesting Custodes list. It is a Solar Spearhead with the single character being a Telemon Heavy Dreadnought with Augury uplink, so he has 5+ Feel No Pain, so he's very difficult to kill. No Blade Champions today, nothing else, just a Telemon Dreadnought, just doing Telemon Dreadnought stuff. We then also have 2 Caladius Grav Tanks, 2 Contemptor Achilles Dreadnoughts, and a Contemptor Galatus Dreadnought. So that's 2 spear-toting Contemptors, as well as the shield and sword guy. We then have 3 Venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts, 2 units of Witch Seekers for utility, and Inquisitor Draxus to jump into that Custodian Guard squad. So we have a little bit of shooting and backline support from that Custodian Guard squad, but then otherwise, we're just running tons and tons of Dreadnoughts and tanks. And this is a list after my own heart. I think this is very straightforward. It's very solid. It's a little bit less technical than some of the Solar Spearheads that we've seen that are taking a smattering of infantry in order to support the big Dreadnoughts, but what it can do is just constantly be rocketing Dreadnoughts onto your objectives over and over and over. We can buff their speed, we can make them advance and charge, we can make them move through walls. Any position in which your opponent has a unit that one of these Contemptors can kill, you can rocket the Contemptor into them, or if you're in a position to do so, you can get the Telemon Dreadnought there. Use their stacked OC characteristics to take those objectives down, and make it very difficult for your opponent to fight through. The Contemptor Achilles and Galatus Dreadnoughts are not too difficult to kill, but when you have to kill them and also deal with 3 Venerable Contemptors that can respawn themselves after dying, that actually does become a legitimate stat check, even though the baseline stats of these Dreadnoughts are not particularly exciting. You're also backing that up with Caladius Grav Tanks. I think these guys end up actually doing a lot of the work in this detachment. The Dreadnoughts create such a solid front line for the backline shooting that it's difficult to prevent your opponent from hitting you with those Caladius, and they just get to keep shooting. And so oftentimes you'll see an opposing anti-tank get picked off as the game goes on by these big Arachnus Blaze Cannons firing from the back end of the table. Now with this, we're going to move to Sweden and talk about Grip Figurspel GT. This was a 22-player GT and was won by Jacob Edvison, running Chaos Demons using a Legion of Excess. We haven't seen necessarily the same domination of Legion of Excess this week as we have been seeing in previous weeks, but they are still on the board with a GT win here. I appreciate the name of this list, by the way, the Crab Rave, because we are focusing on Soul Grinders today. So what are we taking in this list includes 2 Contorted Epitomes, 2 Keepers of Secrets, Celeste, and the Mask of Slaanesh. Celeste obviously in there, good for their ability to respawn after getting killed. They're a solid inclusion just as a utility unit almost. Difficult for your opponent to deal with. The Keepers of Secrets, one has False Majesty, so we give that +1 to Wound Aura. The other one was Soul Glutton, so it heals itself after destroying enemies. The Contorted Epitomes are important in here, however, because they can attach into Demonette units and grant a 4+ Feel No Pain against mortal wounds to protect them from wounds received by Thief of Pain. The reason that's relevant is that we're taking a Soul Grinder at the end here. So we have the standard allotment of Fiends. It's only 9 Fiends this time around, and a Seeker Chariot for some utility. A couple of Nurgle Demons as well to hold down objectives, a Plague Bearer unit for OBSEC, and a Beast of Nurgle just to be a cheap, hardy unit, plus some Seekers of Slaanesh for early game forward operation. But last and certainly not least, we have that Soul Grinder. The Soul Grinder has the vehicle keyword, not the monster keyword. It is fairly monstrous, but not officially a monster, I guess, according to Games Workshop, which means that it is eligible to pass wounds off thanks to Thief of Pain, unlike the Keepers of Secrets. So this Soul Grinder can sort of wander up into the middle of the table, blank basically 50% of all incoming damage thanks to its invulnerable save. Any of that damage that passes through, you can then Thief of Pain onto a Contorted Epitome, which can then 4+ Feel No Pain it until all the demons are dead, at least. So this thing essentially has something the equivalent of past its invulnerable save, like 30-ish wounds, I guess, depending on how often you're going to be assigning damage to your Contorted Epitome as well. And that makes this Soul Grinder incredibly difficult to kill, even if it is also difficult to maneuver around the table. Kind of an interesting, slightly more hardy variety of the army than we've been seeing from this army in the past. A lot of times it's focusing on those Fiends, and they can, unless their sort of anti-shooting stratagems work incredibly well, they can be picked off pretty easily by shooting attacks. Less so for the Soul Grinder, who has a much more impressive defensive stat line. And then that allows the 2 Keepers of Secrets to kind of just do whatever they want towards the late game. The False Majesty aura also benefits the Soul Grinder as well. I think that's important to note, and it gets plus 1 AP from being near a Keeper of Secrets. So that False Majesty Keeper of Secrets staple to the back of that Soul Grinder can actually make it do sort of insane damage, especially once it starts charging and getting its Seductive Gambit rerolls as well. Now we're going to remain in Sweden for a little bit here and talk about the Games of Westeros 19. This was a 124-player major level event, and we had some interesting results. Lots of draws at the end of round 5 of this one, thanks to the differential scoring that they used. But the top placer here was Dag Samuelson, who was running a Tyranid invasion fleet. We also saw some tying Tyranids, also undefeated at the event, but they were much lower placing. This invasion fleet included 2 Broodlords as well as a Hive Tyrant with adaptive biology to protect it with a Feel No Pain, 2 Exocrines as well as a Biovore for utility, 2 units of Gene Stealers for some early game pressure, alongside 2 Lictors, a Norn Emissary, and 3 Tyrannofexes, 2 with Rupture Cannons and 1 with an Acid Spray. This army is pretty emblematic of a lot of Tyranid armies more recently. The Gene Stealers are an interesting inclusion. We have been seeing them taken a little bit more recently in invasion fleet armies, although the downside is that outside of their scout movement, they are relatively slow and kind of difficult to deliver into melee. I do wonder if there was a terrain component here that makes them a little bit easier to deliver sort of towards the early to mid game, especially if you don't go first. If you do go first and they can just move a bunch of times up the middle of the table and take a dominating position and then charge in the future, that's actually pretty easy for them. But if you don't go first, I think it might be tough to actually deliver those guys. That said, they have a bunch of attacks. They're relatively lethal, and they can get benefits like sustained hits against infantry from the detachment ability. That is a big deal for these guys that are already getting a couple of baked-in hit rerolls from their datasheet ability already. Now with that, let's talk about the Clutch City GT. This is a 156-player major, one of the big events that went down this weekend, and this one had a bunch of really interesting results. Ended up being won by Orks, but we also saw undefeated results from Aeldari and Imperial Knights, which we'll be talking about momentarily. Now, the event was won by Alberto Nicholas, running a Warhorde. Been a hot minute since we've seen a Warhorde doing well. We've been talking a lot about tactical brigades as well as dread mobs, but Warhorde has just kind of been cooking in the corner, I think. That detachment didn't really go anywhere. We have 2 war bosses as well as a war boss in mega armor with Follow Me Lads to improve the movement characteristic of his unit, alongside a mech. We then have a bunch of trucks, 3 trucks to carry these boys around in, as well as a battle wagon for that mech to support, 3 units of Break-A-Boys, as well as 2 units of Flash Gits. I do wonder if some of the reason for the inclusion of the mech there is he is a pretty solid lone operative character when he's hanging out by vehicles, so you can use him as utility. You can also buff up a truck inhabited by Flash Gits and give it +1 to hit, which will affect all of its firing deck weapons, which actually makes it pretty good at knocking small units out by peeking line of sight with them. It doesn't get the Flash Gits datasheet abilities, but it is actually much easier to draw line of sight for them because you only have to draw line of sight from a single point on the truck itself, rather than trying to do so from 2 wholly units of guys with 40 mil bases, which can get really difficult. So that's actually a nice little inclusion to fight other utility units in the early game without having to commit your big hefty knob squads like your Break-A-Boys. We then have 2 units of Gretchen, a Mega Knobs unit for that Mega War Boss to jump into, 2 units of Storm Boys for utility, as well as 3 Tank Bustas. Now, what is curious here is that we don't have any attachments for the Tank Bustas. Normally, we would see big mechs with shock attack guns, but we're focusing almost entirely on the melee infantry that are getting the benefits from that Warhorde. You're getting sustained hits from the detachment ability, alongside things like Unbridled Carnage to improve their critical hit effects, which are enormous buffs for units like Break-A-Boys that have a relatively low attack volume but really high impact attacks. Definitely makes sense why you would include them in an army like this one. Pretty cool to see Warhorde still doing well here, and I do think that Warhorde is definitely one of the better places to run Break-A-Boys if you're looking to play them, because any benefit that they get in melee absolutely skyrockets their damage output through the roof. Now, with that, let's move down to 3rd place here at this event and talk about Jason Weeks, who was running an Imperial Knight and Noble Lance. His army was led by Canis Rex and had a bunch of armigers, 4 armiger Helverins, as well as 5 armiger Warglaives. That was followed up by a Calidus Assassin, a Sister Battle Immolator, and a Sister Battle Squad to jump in that Immolator. Now, I think I talked at length about these armies last week when we discussed the Cherokee Open, and we saw some very, very strong results from these Imperial Knight armies there. It's essentially the addition of the Sister Battle Immolator is such a huge benefit to the Knights faction. It gives you a way to pretty easily include many units in your army. The Immolator in the Sister Battle Squad only costs 230 points, about half the cost of a Big Knight or the cost of 2 armigers, but you get 3 units in that because you get the Immolator, the combat squad inside the Immolator, and the other half of the combat squad. It also gives you a way to strip cover, which immediately makes Armiger Helverins stronger, and it gives you some anti-infantry shooting from the Immolator and some non-Armiger-locked anti-tank weapons from the Sisters of Battle inside it as well. This inclusion was kind of transformative to the faction, definitely made it much nicer. Also having objectives secured so that you can play a little bit more fast and loose with your objectives as you are taking table space. Up the table is enormous as well. So a huge benefit to Imperial Knights. And it's definitely no mystery that with that inclusion, we're seeing Imperial Knights do a lot better than we did in previous formats. But with that, that is all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to let me know down in the comment section which army was your favorite. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.